My name is Jack Meyer. I'm an interviewer for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. I have the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Harold L. Ellis on November 2nd, 2006 at the Blue Ash Branch Library. Our camera operator today is Mr. Joel Corneli. First, let me say, Mr. Ellis, we really appreciate your coming in to take part in this project. And now what I'd like to ask you to do is just to sort of start at the beginning, a word or two about your early life, where you went to school, and how you came to join the service, and then go on from there and give us your experiences in the service.
Fun. I was born in Cincinnati, May 22nd, 1925. It puts me about 81 right now. And went to elementary, high school, Norwood, and then post-military service, University of Cincinnati, and received a certificate in architecture. But while I was in high school, we had the opportunity, because World War was already in progress, of course, we had the opportunity to enroll in what they call the pre-induction program. And this was to train high school age boys in skills that the military might be able to use later on. I always fancied airplanes, aircraft, built models, etc. So I enrolled in engine repair and maintenance and had considerable training in hopes that that would give me some advanced standing, knowing full well I was probably be drafted, and that I could get in the Air Force. Well, of course, it didn't quite work out that way. I've always had eye problems. I was born with a degenerative disease, which has been fortunately very slow taking over. But in any event, it was enough to keep me out of the Air Corps. It was in those days, not the Air Force. So I was drafted, and I had an opportunity prior to being called to work at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In those days, it was two separate locations, Patterson Field in Fairborn, on engines and aircraft. I liked that a whole lot, and I thought that would give me a better chance even to get in the Air Corps. But in any event, I was then called to the draft, and my life changed completely. We were taken to Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Was a military location in greater Cincinnati, Fort Thomas, Kentucky, where we were given physicals and so forth, and then told when to report back and be prepared to relocate. You're in the Army now. So we went back there, we boarded train, and about 5-6 days later we were in Oregon. I enjoyed the trip across the country. I kept notes, and every sign I could read of the location I wrote it down, and I still have that information at home. But I was assigned to Division Artillery, 884th Field Artillery Battalion, and A Battery. And we took basic at Camp Adair, which was located near Corvallis, Oregon. It was my first exposure to the northwest part of this country. I liked it a whole lot. I didn't care for the weather because we started out in August, September, and then the rainy season starts in that part of the U.S. The winters were pretty miserable, or the only winter I was there. But we took basic there on 105 howitzers and began to get the knack of it. Got over the shock of it being an infantry division, thinking that I was going to be issued some sort of a rifle or something and become an infantryman, but fortunately it was field artillery. After basic, we went to Yakima, Washington for maneuvers on a desert up there. Did a lot of firing and advanced training and so forth. And then shortly thereafter, they began to select from the 70th Infantry Division and I guess reduce its size to what it would be when it went overseas. But in any event, they took a number of us out and we were sent as replacements and sent to Fort Ord, California, where we had some advanced training, combat training, infiltration courses, a lot of shooting and things like that. Then from there we were sent to Camp Stoneman, which was inland from San Francisco, and this was a POE, port of embarkation. We were there a short period of time, and just as a interesting thing, we were moved from Camp Stoneman down to Oakland, California to board a ship to go overseas. And for that move, we were on a paddle wheel steamer.
On the Delta Queen or the Delta King?
The Delta Queen.
Okay.
It wasn't called that then.
Right.
But yes, that's what it was, absolutely. And then we were...
So you're one of the few Cincinnatians who know that the Delta Queen came from California.
Oh. But then in Oakland, we boarded a Dutch cargo vessel, a converted freighter, and called the Boschfontein. And it had a Dutch crew and a lot of Far Easterners as crew members.
Yeah.
Most of the announcements on the PA was in Dutch. It was giving the crew directions to do this and that. And but we had bunks 6 high in the cargo holds. I had taken or was assigned to the one on top. So I stood my stuff up there and jumped down, only to crack my ankle. This is before we ever left the dock. Cracked my ankle on the edge of a hatch cover. And so I sailed through the Golden Gate in the dispensary, but I did hobble to a porthole and got to see the bridge as we went under it. And but fortunately, it was nothing serious. I was about 2 days, I think, in the dispensary, and then back on deck. And I say on deck literally because I don't think I spent a night below decks. I ended up, fortunately the weather permitted it, I slept on an ammo box. And a lot of the guys were above decks. It was just, well, not very pleasant experience. And we sailed across the Pacific, zigzagging, and
Were you in a convoy or were you sailing alone?
we were alone.
Okay.
We were alone. And we stopped at Milne Bay, which is the extreme eastern tip of New Guinea. And some people got off and some people got on. We stayed on board. From there, we then went west along the north coast of New Guinea to a place that I can't really pinpoint. It's been called Buna, Guna, Oro Bay. It was an area where the Aussies came from Port Moresby over the Owen Stanley Range to fight the Japanese. And the Japanese had occupied this particular area, and they got them out of there, and they set up an army camp and airstrip and things like that. And we were there just as replacements, not assigned to anybody yet, and stayed there briefly. One occasion, which was got our attention, they marched us all to a supply area, and we were all issued folding stock M1 carbines. This is the shorter weapon, not the M1 rifle. And the folding stock was what the airborne used.
Yeah.
And we had heard that you could volunteer for the airborne, and we could see C-47s taking off daily, I guess, on training flights and so forth. Most of us were not prepared for that.
Yeah.
And not too receptive. We were taken back to the area and told to clean the cosmoline off the rifles, which we did, and then take them back to the supply and turn them in.
Oh.
Much relieved. Also in New Guinea, it's kind of funny, it used to rain every afternoon, just like, well, we said, that, if I may, cow peeing on a flat rock. And frequently you'd lather up, be out in there, and the rain would stop just as quick as it came on. And but that was something we looked forward to because it was a great opportunity. We had one well for I don't know how many 100 people, guys, and the water was always stirred up and muddy. But anyway, we left on board an LCI then, which was a landing craft infantry, and went to Finschhafen. Finschhafen had at one time been a German missionary location. And that's where I was assigned to the 465th Field Artillery Battalion, Battery A. And this was an 8-inch howitzer, which was quite a bit larger than the 105 I'd had basic on. But the routines were not that strange. It was just much larger projectile, 200 pound as a matter of fact, and things like that. But anyway, I was given a brief training there, but then assigned to the motor pool. I guess because somewhere in my history that they had, I'd worked on engines,
yep.
Aircraft engines. But anyway, we were there for, oh, I don't know, I'd say maybe 2-3 weeks. And then we were loaded on LSTs, a landing ship tank. And that would accommodate all the personnel as well as our guns and vehicles and supplies. And we sailed to Hollandia, which was a little bit farther west on the north coast of New Guinea, in an area that had been occupied by the Japanese, and it was now the location of General MacArthur's headquarters. And there they were marshaling the fleet to invade the Philippines at Leyte Island. Now this was in October 1944. And I never saw so many ships in my whole life. I couldn't believe it. As they were preparing and marshaling and getting everything collected and ready to take off, they would let us dive overboard and swim. So we had that, but they also had a gun out there, or a boat out there with a gunner on it in case sharks or something like that might happen. Maybe somebody get tired and they could fish them out. But anyway, we then sailed from Hollandia in a huge convoy. Just as far as you could see, there were ships on the open ocean, all kinds of ships, serious ships, I mean, with big guns on them, like battleships, cruisers, as well as all sorts of LSTs and smaller vessels. But the original landing was scheduled for October 20th at Leyte. Strategically, it was about in the center of the Philippines, and I would guess not as well defended as maybe some of the other larger islands. They held us off, and that is the 8-inch artillery pieces, until October 22nd, because they were getting mortar fire on the beach area. And where we landed, there had been an airstrip, and I don't know if it was there prior to the Japanese occupation or not, but nevertheless, there was an airstrip that was parallel to the shoreline. And the LST would just go in there until it ran aground, drop a ramp, well, open the doors in the bow, drop a ramp, and then they would unload the vehicles. Well, we had quite a bit to do, and this was an overnight operation, so many of us were assigned to work in the water and fill sandbags to keep the ramp. They had to push up some sand to lower the ramp on, and the tide or the waves would erode that sand, so we put sandbags there, and so some of us were in water, although it's up as chest deep sometimes, depending on the tide. Until we got it all unloaded, and the guns went on in, and of course they were among the first things to be unloaded. And so we were still, many of us were still there at the landing site. And then finally they came and got us, loaded us on some vehicles, and taking us to the firing position where the guns had been set in place. And en route, we heard some gunfire, and we looked up, and there was a burst up in the air, anti-aircraft. And then we were watching where that burst was, and there was a second burst which hit the airplane, which was really an accomplishment. And it had been a Japanese Zero who had come in, I guess, to do whatever he thought he could. There was a lot of harassing flights like that. I can't recall ever seeing more than one Japanese plane at a time on Leyte. And they would come in, and it was just harassment. Now, maybe it would be a single-seat fighter, maybe it would be a twin-engine bomber they called a Betty, and that was maybe roughly the size of one of our B-25s, but not near the airplane a B-25 was. But that was our first experience, and of course, the vehicle we were riding on stopped, and we didn't know what was going on, and there were shell craters alongside the road where the Navy vessels had shelled prior to our landing, apparently, so we all jumped down in that, and of course there was nothing. It was all over in a matter of a couple of minutes. And we went on to our gun position, and as I said before, I'd been assigned to the motor pool, so I wasn't in a firing group yet as a cannoneer, even though my MOS was fuse setter. That's what my formal assignment was on the 105 after basic. So it was quite an experience to see them in action. It was something new. I'd never been associated anyway with a gun that size. And then I don't know, we started hearing heavy gunfire, and unbeknownst to us at that time, this was one of the largest naval battles in World War II. I've heard that it was the largest, and it was the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
Leyte Gulf, yeah.
Yes. And then the Japanese were successful in seriously damaging some of the smaller carriers that only carried, Wildcats, Burma Wildcats, or fighter planes, or maybe something as large as a torpedo bomber. But they weren't near the carrier that most people are familiar with. They were converted Liberty ships, and sometimes just a converted tanker because they were long enough to have a nice runway on it. But we lost some of those, and some of the planes were still in the air, and they were looking for a place to land. And that little old airstrip that we had crossed, the engineers had gotten to it, or the CBs probably, and had this corrugated landing strip partially in place. But in any event, we happened to be back down there to pick up some more supplies, which had just been unloaded, but they were left on the beach. The LSTs had left by then. But going down there and picking this stuff up, some of these wildcats were coming in, and they had a very narrow tread, and they'd hit that runway and they'd flip. Well, fortunately, none of them caught fire or anything like that, or none that we saw, and the pilots all got out okay. But there was a lot of naval aircraft flying around there just looking for a place to land. There was a Curtiss Helldiver, which was a dive bomber. It had a 3-man crew that bellied into a rice paddy not far from our firing position. And safely, you know, just a big splash and a lot of noise, a lot of excitement. And some Filipinos waded out to them and picked them up on their shoulders and brought them in. They didn't even get wet. So, but then after the Japanese were being pushed back across the island, we moved, our firing position was moved, and narrow 2-lane roads, and just a whole brand new experience, nothing that I had never read about or anything like that. And I know there was one area where we had to cross a creek, and it was probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 feet from the roadbed down to the creek, and a little old girder iron bridge, 1 lane. Our prime mover and our gun combined was about 30 tons. So they had to separate them, and the prime mover crossed the bridge first, and the bridge would just shake and rattle, believe me. And once the prime mover got on the other side, they then undid a cable from a winch and brought it over and hooked it up to the gun, and then brought the gun across, and then they hooked up, and away they went. And the next one took turns, you know. And we went on up that road some distance inland. I would estimate maybe 25 miles, possibly. And near a village called Caragero, which is on the north shore of Leyte Island. And incidentally, where we landed was very near Tacloban, which is, or was, the capital of Leyte, and I would assume it still is. But anyway, at Caragera, we were near there, and set up in a firing position that would give us, we could reach the far shore of the island, and by now the Japanese were making their last stand, so to speak, on Leyte. We would still get the harassing aircraft. We had one that got a bomb into our area one night. And of course, when we would take a position, we would scatter our ammunition. The powder was in a separate location, and the projectiles and all of this was away from the guns and humanity, if you please. They got a bomb, and it got into our powder that we had stored, and big fire and so forth. And also, unfortunately, that bomb also killed one of our men. He was a Sioux Indian, heck of a nice guy. But he had taken refuge in a prime mover to spend the night, so he wasn't in a foxhole or anything, and he got fatally wounded. But then we could reach, like I say, the far side of the island, and so we were in that position longer than we were in any other on Leyte. Well, we only had those 2 positions, as a matter of fact, our battery. The rest of the battalion, we were not assigned to a division. We were a corps artillery, which means that they would break us up, the 3 firing batteries, and send us in many different directions, just depending on where the support was needed, where they thought an 8-inch howitzer would be appropriate for the need.
So all 3 batteries, or the whole battalion was 8-inch, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And but a battery, we stayed in our position, and I don't know exactly the disposition of the other batteries. Sometimes they were nearby, and sometimes they weren't. But then it was, I don't know, November, early December, we had a typhoon. It was terrible. I never saw it rain so hard and the wind blow so hard. Coconuts were just falling off of coconut trees, just like pebbles, except they certainly were not pebbles. It got to the point where the road that we had used became impassable from military traffic to the point where it couldn't, you'd have to have an amphibious vehicle. Full track was what they were using. It seemed to be what would negotiate it, but we could no longer get water from the water point, so we had to use water that we could collect otherwise, and treat it with iodine or something to make it suitable for drinking. And but that was quite an experience. Of course, there wasn't much activity during the storm as far as fire missions. But then they told us that after the storm and things had gotten better in a few days, why we saddled up and went back to the beach. And the battle for Leyte was essentially over. I guess you could say it was secured. And there on the beach, it was kind of an R&R, a rest and relaxation experience, some maintenance on the pieces. They gave us some shots and things like that. I had some dental work done that was interesting there. There was a technician, 5th grade, who rode a bicycle, which drove the dentist drill. And it was sort of a whoa kind of thing. And it wasn't painful, but it was just sort of, I don't know, you never really got used to it. But anyway, they took care of me, and then, and like I say, shots and so forth. And then they told us we were going to go to another location. And they loaded us all up in the LSTs again. And away we went. En route, we were told it was Luzon. And Luzon had been invaded already. We landed Luzon came through Lingayen Gulf, which is not the extreme north end, but north of Manila. And that's where the main landings were made. They held us off there. We didn't go, they didn't hold us off. We were just late starting because they didn't want us there earlier, apparently. I guess we were maybe a week, 10 days after the initial invasion. And when we landed there, now we would travel as a battalion. That means all the firing pieces and all the support and everything we traveled together. But once we landed on Luzon, they broke us up again. And some of the batteries were assigned to support ground troops going toward Manila, south direction. We stayed more around the central part of Luzon and then started working north. And the Japanese were retreating north as well as south. And by south, that was, they were concentrated in the Manila area, and they were concentrated in the north. Now, the ones in the north were pretty well isolated. And they were fighting, excuse me, but they didn't have supplies, had no way of getting supplies, and so forth. But anyway, and it was quite a mountainous area. And we chased them that way, and one of the areas that we were through, it had been an agricultural college pre-war. The Japanese had occupied it as a maintenance area for their armor. their tanks, and their tanks were really tin cans. And in that area, they had very little fuel to run any vehicle on. So many of the tanks have been placed in pits with only the turret exposed so that they could use them as a pillbox, so to speak. That really was not very successful for them. I mean, they were overwhelmed by our infantry. They would hide in shocks of rice that had been harvested and put in shocks. They weren't like the fodder shocks we might be familiar with here that's done with corn. They were similar to that, but they weren't that tall. And then as part of the way to neutralize that threat, frequently they were set fire. And, but anyway, under the circumstances, you do what's necessary to prevail, and we moved on, even though it was not always pretty. We then begin to get into this is working north again. One of our firing positions was in a little town called Natividad. And for some reason, I always remember that. When we would put our guns in firing position, they would take a bulldozer and they would scoop up an earth revetment around in front of pieces. Just sort of protection, because the 8-inch howitzer, we had to be standing up to do some of the operations, and you know, having an earth revetment provided some protection from small arms fire or whatever. But I remember there was a little Filipino man. He looked old, and he climbed up on top of the revetment by our piece. He had an old scraggly cigar in his mouth. He was puffing, and he just stood there and he looked and he looked, and he was just overwhelmed. It was, I would guess, the biggest thing in his whole life. What he'd been through, what was going on, and I guess what it will be like in the future for him, you know. But it was kind of moving. There was no exchange of words or anything, but he just stood there fixed for quite a long time. And I don't specifically remember, but we might have had a fire mission, and you know, he had to leave the premises, but whatever. But as we worked on up north, we took a position where we could fire on the Leyte Pass. And this was a strong point for the Japanese. I never saw it personally because we were some distance away and firing on it. But they frequently dug tunnels or holes in the Leyte Pass. They dug tunnels clear through the mountains. Now, by mountains, they're not like the Rockies, but very rugged terrain, but not real high above sea level, but exceptionally rugged. But they would dig tunnels clear through from one side of the mountain to the other, and they would roll artillery pieces out and fire. And then they would haul them back in the tunnel. And part of our responsibility was to try to discourage that as much as possible. And we would fire a lot of bracket fire, which meant you fired to the top of the mountain, to the bottom of the mountain, and then you start working that in till you just have covered the whole face. And sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't, or if it did close up the tunnels, they would dig out again. And so then they finally brought in a 90mm anti-aircraft gun and placed it. This is really rugged terrain now, and I have no idea how in the world they got it up above us on the mountainside. But it was up and in a position where it could fire direct. It had a very flat trajectory on its projectile. It fired directly into those tunnels. Now, that was the intent, and I guess it had some success because later on, the Japanese in that area weren't the threat that they had been. But then we started getting infiltration. And after Leyte, we had no experience with Japanese aircraft. But on Luzon, there was infiltration that we had not experienced at Leyte. And we were in a relatively flat area. Like I say, it was very rugged terrain. The road that any vehicle used bisected our firing position. We had 2 guns on one side of the road and 2 guns on the other. And this is, again, A battery. Where B battery and C battery was, I don't know. They were in that general part of Luzon, but because but they were mostly down farther toward the Manila because they've been supporting that effort. But we had lots of infiltration. They would come in, and we had set up, of course, we had the revetments in front of the guns, and then we set up a perimeter out some distance, struck wires, and had things hanging on them that if somebody hit one of those wires, why something would ring or chime or make a noise, or even a trip flare, which would be ignited and would go up in the air, and then provide very brilliant illumination at night, and hanging on a little parachute would come down. And of course, that would help us, but it wasn't always the best thing, especially the trip flare, because as soon as the propellant charge went off, whoever was out there would freeze, and it was difficult to see them sometimes. So some of the guys, by now I'm no longer in the motor pool. I'm now assigned to an artillery piece as a fuse setter. And some of the guys in the motor pool started taking the headlamps out of our vehicles, and they hooked them up to batteries out of the vehicles, put them on top of the revetments. So instead of trip flares, they'd just flip a switch and the headlights would come on. Well, there was no clue to that for the Japanese until those lights came on. And that helped. But then there was one night where they got in too close, right to the base of the revetment before they were discovered. And they had mines, magnetic mines, which they would, a magnetic mine, and they'd just stick it to the gun, the artillery piece, because it was metal to metal, and it would just, and of course then it would detonate, and the idea was it was to damage the piece to where it could be used. They also had wooden boxes that were maybe 8 or 10 inches square, maybe 2 inches high, with a rope attached to them. And I only know what somebody told me, that they were pitric acid and it was an explosive, and I don't know any more about that. But they would take those, and their hand grenades, incidentally, to detonate their hand grenade. With ours, you pulled a pin. With theirs, you had to strike it on something, and it sounded like a cap pistol going off. So it would just a crack, and then they'd throw the grenade or whatever. Well, these pitric acid pieces had a hand grenade detonator on it. It would go crack like that. And then they'd take this rope and they'd whirl it around and sail it, and they could throw those things quite some distance, and that was to get into the area. So I think we only had 1 or 2 of those penetrate and no damage, but the one night they got a grenade in, and one of the members of the gun crew near that took his helmet and held it over the grenade, and it went off and removed most of both hands.
Yeah.
And that was, I guess, our only real casualty on Luzon. That is from combat. We were later told that this was a group of Japanese engineers. Now, they never had weapons. We know that for a fact because I was part of a group that we had personal experience with one, and he was fired on and didn't survive. And he did not have a weapon, and so I assumed when we were told that none of them did, and they were living in a cave not far from our gun position. And there was plenty of ordnance there in the way of mines, grenades, and stuff like that. But no, and rifles, but no ammunition. No ammunition. Apparently they'd used it all up. And the infantry took care of them. And then we were pulled out of, there was one other incident which was a little exciting. When we were working our way north, we were taken to a position. The intent was we would be put in a firing position where we would fire on Baguio. Now, Baguio was the summer capital of the Philippines. The rest of the year it was in Manila, but Baguio was in the mountains and it was cooler, and that was a more comfortable place to be in the summertime. Well, were taken again on a very narrow road until finally that road ran out, and it ran into a leveled out area that on three sides, I guess, were mounds where it looked like they had just dug this out of the hillside, this level area. And the sides of this was, it'd go up maybe 10 or 15 feet. So we had a perimeter up there. But then somewhere along the line, either we had been misdirected to an unsecured area, we were later told, or Baguio had been neutralized. But in any event, we did not fire anything there, but because we were at a dead end, and when the only way out was the only way in, they decided we'd better reinforce ourselves at least overnight, so they dispatched some trucks to some location and came back with Filipino guerrillas, or guerrillas they called themselves. They were very willing to serve us, and they were armed, and they reinforced our perimeter to the point where they shot at who knows what all night long. It was disturbing because you didn't know whether it was for real or whether it wasn't. And it wasn't for real. They just were shooting all the time. But then, anyway, we were then, after the Leyte Pass, obviously we got out of that area and then went up in the Leyte Pass, and things began to ease up and we could relax a little bit. And we had moved to another position, but didn't fire from that position, but from that position, little narrow road again, and because there was inactivity, we were just snooping around and we found an abandoned 37 millimeter Japanese gun on artillery piece, on very small, of course, and some weapons. Apparently they had left that area in a hurry. Now, not before they took the time. They damaged the weapons so they were inoperative, but the weapons were there and ammunition. And they had also, unbeknownst to us, there was a little concrete culvert there. And it was only after we had gone over that culvert with our vehicles, 15, 30 tons, that we discovered they had buried artillery projectiles fuse up on either side of that culvert. And those fuses were dented, had been driven over, and we were so lucky, so lucky, yeah. What it took to arm the fuse or why it didn't work, who knows, but thank goodness it didn't. But then they, things were really, I guess, very secure in the Manila area, and in our area it was really running down. They moved us down into a area where it was just R&R again. Now, all during my experience, even in basic, at Fort Ord, which I mentioned earlier, well, basic at Camp Adair, then at Fort Ord, and even overseas, I made people I was with very much aware that I didn't see good at night. I was night blind. I always had been, as a child playing hide and seek. Everybody could find me, but I had a terrible time finding them. But in any event, and I did that to make them aware of the fact that I didn't want to do something dumb. I didn't want to end up hurting somebody. During basic, I had to serve the duty roster and as a guard at night, and they finally, I kept challenging people when there was really no need to challenge them, because anybody with good night vision could have seen the guy was on our side. So they just put me on as a supernumerary. I had to fill my spot in the duty roster. At Fort Ord, it was the same thing. I explained to them, and we had to do infiltration courses and so forth. And, but nonetheless, I still had to serve. I was not exempt from this. And overseas, especially when we got into combat, I made them very aware of the fact again. And we always had, as heavy artillery, we weren't quite as mobile. We could move around, but we weren't as mobile as the smaller pieces, or certainly as a foot soldier. So we had foxholes. And we had, most of the time, we even had tents and cots with mosquito bars. You know, it was not bad, because when we got in a position, we stayed there for a while. But I had told the people around me that if push came to shove, and we had to take refuge in a foxhole, and if I saw a silhouette, that silhouette was going to get shot. I never had to do that, fortunately. But I had to do something to make them aware of this. So, and then when we got back into R&R, I guess it was one of the officers suggested that maybe I see the medics again, you know. And because, well, there was already talk of invading Japan, and nobody knew, of course, when or where or anything like that. We'd had some classes on the proximity fuse, which would detonate an artillery projectile just because of that projectile's proximity to something. Right. We had not used those before.
Did you ever use them?
Hmm?
Did you ever use them?
No,
okay.
We did not. Especially up in the mountainous terrain where we were, because they might detonate just because they were going over a hill or something closer than the target. Yeah. And that, you know, might be a premature thing. And even though it was a howitzer, you fire high and lob in sort of like a mortar.
Well, what was the maximum range of that 8-inch? Do you know? Or what range are you typically firing?
It seemed to me like we could go maybe 15, 18 miles. Mm-hmm. We had green bag and white bag powder charges, right. And each one of those was, the white bag was the more powerful, mm-hmm. And each one of those was even broken into different bags. Right. And it seems to me like they might have been bag 1 through 7 green and maybe 1 through 7 white. I'm a little vague. I think the white was maybe that, and maybe the green wasn't. But anyway, and it just depended on the target, its proximity, as to which bag, which powder charge you used. Incidentally, we had to swab between each round too, because the projectile was rammed in. Then you inserted the powder bags, and of course if there was any sparks in there from the previous round having been fired, it would have gone off when you put the new powder in. So we had to swab the bore between each round just from the breech end. We didn't have to swab it all the way through the whole barrel or the whole tube, just to make sure there was no sparks in there. Then ram in a projectile, then put the powder bag in, and then they used a pistol cartridge in the firing mechanism. And when you pull the lanyard, and that pistol cartridge fired and detonated the powder bags.
Hold on, you want to stop for a minute?
And the officer had suggested I see the medics, and so I did, because who knows where we might be going next, and it might have been Japan, and you know, I guess they'd rather have guys that are certainly physically fit, not necessarily a threat to our side. But in any event, I saw a colonel they'd set up a temporary hospital in a bombed out school, and they did a spinal tap on me, and he interviewed me, and I wanted to know how many campaigns I'd been in, and I told him, and he says, I think we can get you home. And so they flew me to Leyte, back to Leyte, a bunch of us. And we were there and were watching a Danny Kaye movie, and they stopped the movie and said, hey, the Japanese have surrendered. And we were all prepared to ship out the next morning.
Really?
Everybody is carrying on, so they said, hey, let's get the movie back on, you know, because we knew what was going to happen to us. Of course, we were going home, and we didn't want to miss out on that. So we did. We shipped out and stopped at Guam and picked up some GIs that were in pretty bad shape mentally. Then we stopped at Leyte Atoll. I never saw so many ships in my whole life, so apparently we were told that they froze a lot of the shipping and just began to get it collected, not knowing what might be necessary as far as getting into Japan. And then we were near Inuitok Atoll, and we were zigzagging this part of the return trip. And once in a while we'd see another vessel, which might have been an escort of sorts, but didn't seem to be very formal. Anyway, we returned to Seattle, Washington, and I was at there for a short period of time. And then they sent us to, I was an ambulatory patient. I was returned as an ambulatory patient. They sent us to Percy Jones General Hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan, or they sent me there at least, because that was close to my home. And they put you through the usual physicals and all this and that, and see why you're there and what can be done about it, and things like that. And it was really an amputee center, and there were some fellas there that were in pretty bad shape. There was a guy in the bunk next to mine. He had lost an eye and one leg, and he was adjusting to it quite well, except for the prosthesis. I used to have to help him get that off. It was a tug of war sometimes. But anyway, then I was separated, discharged from Fort Custer, which was just outside Battle Creek, Michigan. That was October 25th of 1945. came home, and lollygagged around for a while. We had $300 worth of mustering out pay, and I'd never been so wealthy in my whole life. So we spent some of that. Then I enrolled at the University of Cincinnati, decided I wanted to pursue a career in aviation, and enrolled in aeronautical engineering, and found that I was not at all academically equipped for the load. In those days, they were running 21 weeks of school in 7. And most of the guys that were surviving that, and the academic load, were those that had been through pilot training or OCS or something like that. I had a high school background, and I couldn't do it. So I transferred to architecture, and because I'd always had a fancy for building and design of sorts. But anyway, worked out quite well for me. I never passed state board. I never practiced as an architect. I could legally be a designer, but I did work for firms that sold architectural materials. Had a lot of contact with architects and with general contractors, and in some cases customers doing design work for them. I then retired from a company called Smith & Schaefer here in Cincinnati, that they were institutional furniture was their business. They were representatives of many, many different companies, and we designed home ec departments, libraries, chemistry departments, hospital facilities, and just things like that, and then be able to supply them. And so I did get to practice some of my architectural background, but again, drafting, I did some of that early on, but I couldn't do it as well as it needed to be done, because my eyes just didn't permit it.
Let me ask you another question. I'm curious about being around those big guns. What kind of ear protection did they give you?
None.
Yeah.
You turned your back to it and opened your mouth, and
Yeah.
when it went off, it was like being hit in the back with a board. Now, sometimes you didn't always take that precaution.
Yeah.
Incidentally, when I mentioned the typhoon we had on Leyte, the guns, as you would fire them, they started sinking to the point where if you had a pretty high elevation on the tube, when they recoiled, they'd splash water all over you, because there was a puddle of water down there just from, you know. Now this is a pretty heavy-duty piece of equipment, and when it fired, you know, if it could move something, it did.
Well,
it moved itself, and it went
These
down.
8-inch, they weren't all that common, were they? That's a pretty big gun.
They were based on a 155 chassis,
Yeah.
a 155 long tom, which
Yeah.
was 155 millimeters
Right.
and a much longer range.
Which is more like 6 inches though.
About, yeah,
5 point something.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Okay.
6, right. And
we got 2 minutes to
it
go.
fired a 90-pound projectile.
Right.
They took that same chassis or same frame and put an 8-inch on it.
Okay.
We fired a 200-pound projectile.
Okay, quick question about family. Now, you're married, you have children and grandchildren?
Yes, children, we have 2 sons, one of which lives in France. He's a teacher over there. A daughter that lives in Newport News, Virginia, and she's in academics, a reading specialist. And a son in Cincinnati, lives in Finneytown, and he spent some time in academics at a Montessori school. But our whole family is kind of car buffs, and he's into that end of the business now, buying, selling cars.
Okay. How about,
And we have 2 grandchildren, and they're in France.
really?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else you want to share with us? We've got about half a minute left, probably.
If you're lucky.
I guess I've about run down.
Okay. All right.
I tried to arrange things as chronological as possible, and I, you know, it's probably been said by millions of veterans. I wouldn't take $1 million for the experience, but I wouldn't give a nickel to do it over again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming in, Mr. Ellis,
All right.
and giving us an excellent story here. We really appreciate your taking the time. I know it wasn't real easy for you to do.